Thank you so much for taking the time to view my presentation on the evolution of speaking tasks in the second language classroom. My name is Loren Visser, and I am completing this presentation in part of my thesis research for the Masters of Arts in Second Language Acquisition, Policy, and Culture. I'm currently a German and Spanish teacher based in South Dakota, and so this research is immediately applicable to the choices that I'm making in my classroom. And as a current third year teacher, this research has been incredibly instrumental in me bettering my practice as a teacher. I want to begin this presentation by setting the stage of the current state of second language education in the United States. There are multiple factors affecting this field, but today I'm going to highlight decreased enrollment, the fact that languages are not taken seriously here, which combines with other subjects being prioritized in the United States education system, bad teaching in general, and all of this is leading to what some experts are calling a national security crisis. And I would echo that sentiment. We have seen decreased enrollment in the last 2 decades across both high school level language courses and also in language enrollment programs at the college and university level. The Modern Language Association's analysis from 2023 found that between 2016 and 2021, total college and university enrollment in languages other than English dropped by 16%. And this is at a time when the United States needs knowledge of world cultures and languages in order to prepare its students for the workforce and for being a global citizen in general. We can see this idea of languages not being taken seriously in research done by the US Government Accountability Office in 2017. As of 2016, 23% of overseas language designated positions were filled by foreign service officers who did not meet the position's language proficiency requirements. This is a problem because if we at high levels of government are unable to meet the requirements in order to communicate effectively as a nation on the global stage, that is going to continue to lead to bigger and bigger problems as a global community. Furthermore, this idea of centering English and Americans not taking languages seriously is shown in a Pew Research Center survey from 2016, where only 36% of surveyed adults considered knowing a foreign language to any degree of proficiency important for success in the modern workplace. So we are clearly not focusing, not centering, and not valuing the importance of learning another language. Furthermore, the Council on Foreign Relations notes that most people in the United States, when they say they took a language in high school, say something to the effect of, I took Spanish in high school, but it was terrible and I can't say a word. And I encounter this sentiment out in the world all the time as a language teacher. When I explain that I am a teacher of Spanish and German, most people say that they can only remember to ask how to go to the bathroom or say I need a pencil or something like that. And so unfortunately, because of some bad teaching, we are not progressing our language skills in the United States. Bygate of 2001 notes that when we're talking about speaking skills specifically, a lot of focus is placed on things like pronunciation, which is important to a degree, but not necessarily the most important thing when we're talking about speaking skills. In contrast to Europeans and people from other areas of the world, not just in the United States, in Europe specifically, there are national level mandates that require the study of languages at all levels of formal education, whereas in the United States, only a few states have a foreign language graduation requirement. 10 states and the District of Columbia have a foreign language requirement for high school graduation. 24 states have a requirement that could be met with foreign language classes, but it could also be met with other non-language coursework. And 16 states have no graduation guidelines concerning foreign language education. And all of this is growing to an emphasis on this being a national security crisis, because as we are moving into a continually more global, more connected society, we are failing students in the United States by not providing them access to other languages, which improve global competence, cultural understanding, and in general communication skills. All of the factors on the previous slide led me to develop these research questions. I am curious in finding out what speaking tasks are successful in engaging students, increasing their speaking skills. I'm also curious about whether or not some proven speaking tasks, meaning tasks that previously were very effective in improving student speaking, if they are no longer meeting the mark for students in this decade. With advancements in technology, with changes in the classroom environments and classroom expectations, I feel as though it is possible that some speaking skills are not meeting that mark. I'm also exploring whether or not increasing speaking activities has an impact on overall language ability confidence, and in general, how speaking tasks have evolved over time in response to various methodological trends and the state of other factors in education environments. There are two reasons that I want to focus specifically on speaking skills for this research. Speaking is obviously not the only thing that you are learning when you are studying a foreign language. You are also learning reading skills, writing skills, listening skills, cultural competence, and so much more. But the reason why speaking is so important to me is for two reasons. Because learner goals and expectations often relate to speaking proficiency, and because language is ultimately a communicative tool. And if we are not preparing students to use the language in that way, we are only going to end up with more students that say 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from their language learning journey that I took Spanish in high school and all I can say is, where is the library? And that should not be our goal as teachers. So that is primarily why we are focusing on speaking in this research. While exploring speaking in the second language classroom, it's important to understand what speaking is. Leveled 1993 provides the definition that a speaker is a highly complex information processor who can, in some still rather mysterious way, transform intentions, thoughts, feelings into fluently articulated speech. Level's writing is talking primarily about speaking in your first language, but can be and has been applied to learning a second, third, fourth language, and learning how to speak in that way as well. It is important to note that speaking is reciprocal, meaning that speaking does not necessarily occur just like this presentation, where I am saying words and you are understanding ideas, but rather oftentimes speaking is used in communicating, responding to the words, actions of someone else. It is often accompanied by gestures or other nonverbal input. For example, having not just gestures, but facial expressions, or having context of maybe knowing that a conversation is taking place in a classroom or in a bakery or in an airport provides you with other nonverbal information about what that other person is saying. So when we are preparing students for speaking in a second language, it is important to consider all of these facets of speaking. And we do that in a variety of ways, as we'll see later in this presentation. Speaking has been looked at from a lot of different angles as far as the skills involved in speaking. Some researchers refer to fluency, accuracy, knowledge of grammatical structures, and pronunciation. Some researchers focus on the negotiation of meaning and handling breakdowns in communication. The fact that speaking is happening in live time, you don't necessarily have time to prepare a response, to think very critically about what someone is saying. You're often speaking in impromptu or extemporaneous situations, and that in and of itself is a skill in your native language, which then transitions also into being a skill that one needs to practice in a second language. And other researchers discuss speaking skills in terms of imitative, intensive, responsive, interactive, and extensive tasks. Basically, again, breaking down the social situation in which you're speaking, who you're speaking to, how much advanced preparation is there for the speaking, and all of these factors together come to combine in teacher decisions on how to prepare students to use their second language in a communicative capacity. So, in this research that I am doing that is ongoing, I have been exploring different speaking tasks, their effectiveness, the context in which they are used, and student perception of the different tasks. Some tasks that I've explored are role play, presentations, small talk, drills, dialogues, and discussions. Many of these I have used as both a student and as a teacher to different degrees of effectiveness. Some that I'd like to highlight in comparison to those skills that were discussed on the previous slide would be, for example, drills. Drills do not really highlight the communicative aspect necessarily of language because you are often just repeating what someone else just said, or you are providing a pre-planned response to someone's utterance. And while that is very effective oftentimes for things like pronunciation and for creating functional chunks of language to be able to rely on in spontaneous language production, it doesn't always necessarily serve a communicative purpose. However, things like discussions and role play have an increased value in communicative applications. Over time, curriculum expectations have evolved to a variety of different ways to teach second languages. In my research, I have highlighted a couple, and today in this presentation, I will pull out just a few others. So the four that I've mentioned on this slide are a focus on form, task-based, communicative language teaching, and drama-based. I'd like to talk in detail about task-based teaching and also drama-based because those two have been the most interesting to consider when thinking specifically about speaking and oral language production in the second language classroom. So task-based teaching refers to teaching in which learner engagement is one of the most important parts. So you are providing a task for your students to complete, and you are helping them develop those language skills that will support the completion of that task. For example, you might give students the task of you are trying to get tickets to visit your family in Switzerland, and you need to communicate to the staff at the airport to purchase the tickets, board the airplane, and arrive in Switzerland, or something like that. And so then students are going to be working with the language and also specifically in speaking tasks, finding that communicative engagement. problem with task-based language teaching is that oftentimes teachers do not consider the difficulty of the task, or that they are not adequately considering the supports that match the difficulty of a task for students. It has also been interesting to explore drama-based language learning, which is exactly what it sounds like, using pieces of theater, whether that be monologues, dialogues, or full-length plays, to have students develop language skills in a target language. So you are effectively producing a show or a play, a piece of theater, in that target language. And what's really great about this approach is that you do have the ability to pre-plan all of the speaking. You write the script in advance, typically, or you're using an existing work of literature. And in that pre-planning, it takes away a lot of the stress and anxiety that is often surrounding speaking tasks. However, you do need students that are wanting to be engaged in that specific environment or with the topic that the play is discussing. So all of these and other aspects of curriculum are effective to different degrees and also depend largely on the teacher that is using them. Curriculum is the embodiment of the evolution of theory. So as curriculum expectations have evolved, so too have the understanding of how one learns language to begin with. And what should our priorities be as language teachers? In the 1980s, researchers started working towards this theory of communicative competence, which at the time some authors described as having several different aspects, including a grammatical competence, a sociolinguistic competence, and communicative strategies. And that definition has evolved over time, but in the 1980s we really start to see that focus on using language not just as something that is in books or something that is used to improve logic skills or thinking skills, but actually a thing to be used to communicate. Then we also want to highlight with this research the input hypothesis, which was posited by Krashen. And the part of this that I want to highlight in respect to the research that I've been doing is the idea of comprehensible input, which is essentially input that is a little bit beyond the current level of competence. So you are constantly pushing students to use their existing knowledge and then stretch it a little bit further in the things that they are listening and the things that they are reading. And the idea being that with enough input at a student's level or just a little bit beyond a student's level, eventually they will pick up the language and then be able to produce it. The problem with that, though, according to Meryl Swain, was solved with her output hypothesis in 1985. That hypothesis suggested that in addition to input, like Krashen said, that you also need opportunities for output. And she suggested there being 3 additional functions in language learning, including noticing, hypothesis testing, and a metalinguistic function. What I really want to focus on in this research is the noticing function, because that ultimately is where I see the most concerns with the output hypothesis. How students are able to notice their errors and then use the knowledge of those errors in order to improve their understanding is what I am most interested in. And that led me to the concept of the double output hypothesis, which is first kind of labeled as that by Jiang in 2010. And this is basically saying that yes, we need input, yes, we need output, but we need to be a little bit more structured with that output. They suggest that first, input is processed. So you hear language, you're reading language, and then having an opportunity to write using those structures, and then to have a speaking task that follows the writing that helps you to further internalize grammar and vocab. This idea is furthered by researchers in 2013 who, in offering criticism of um, communicative language teaching, they say that oftentimes we need more practice than just writing things out. We need more practice than just listening to things. And that is where the idea of a double output hypothesis becomes very interesting. The idea of a double output hypothesis has really taken root in my mind throughout this research, and now I'm starting to explore what that looks like in my classroom. And so we're really thinking about having some input, lots of input actually, breaking that down into writing where students have time to really think about the language that they're producing, and then to be able to transfer that into a speaking task. So I'm going to give you two examples of how this has manifested in my classroom and talk through how the research has influenced my choices. The first example I want to talk about comes from the context of a Spanish 1 classroom. I have been teaching this class for 3 years now, and I teach it alongside a co-teacher. So we are working together to stay in the same themes, the same grammar principles, we have the same assessments, so on and so forth. And one of the units that we did in the fall was a weather unit. And in the past, I have approached this weather unit with much more emphasis on input and not as much opportunity for students to produce output. The reasoning for that was because the assessment that ended that unit was had an emphasis on reading tasks. However, I wanted students to still get that opportunity to be testing their language hypotheses and to be able to notice their errors so that as we are moving into other units that require them to have more speaking competence, that we are able to still be increasing those skills. So in this unit, they received a lot of input using weather terminology. For example, we described the weather every day as a class. We described several pictures. We looked at weather reports across the Spanish-speaking world and also just the United States in general. We compared, we contrasted. All of this was mostly me speaking in Spanish and students following along and showing their understanding in various ways through comprehension questions and such like that. Throughout the week, or throughout the unit, excuse me, we also wrote down what the weather was every day and wrote down answers to some of those other questions as we were exploring this vocabulary. And then finally, towards the end of the unit, we did this activity, which used some of that pre-planning, some of that pre-writing, and now asked students to use that in a speaking task, where some students received this table and other students received a table that had the blank spots from this one filled in, and then they had other blank spots. And so the task was for students to ask what the weather was like on a specific day in a specific place, and the other student then had to provide that information based on a picture, not based on words. So they had to form the sentence or form the statement, it's rainy, it's cloudy, it's snowing, it's windy, in order to be able to communicate that idea to their partner. The second example I want to talk about comes from the German 2 setting. In this class, students have been working with the past tense recently, actually for the past several months. And we have done a variety of tasks that ask us to use that past tense, often in response to things that we did over the weekend. So on a Monday, we often have conversations that are trying to trigger that past tense, to really work on using the different forms, correct conjugations, pronunciation, word order, things like that. So initially, when we first introduced this, I would give a recap of my weekend or the day before at the beginning of every class. And I would have pictures that would accompany. At the very beginning, I even had the sentences that I was saying directly on the board so that they got the visual input of what the sentences look like as well. And slowly, I started taking structures away, having just keywords on the board, just pictures on the board, nothing on the board, just the auditory input, and intermixing those scaffolds throughout. And then slowly, students started having to respond as well. Initially, just a yes/no answer, and then they had to respond with a phrase and then a full sentence. And then eventually we added on listening to each other. And that is what this table is looking at, is a list of questions about what you did over the weekend or what you did the previous day. And the first column, meine Antwort, is asking you to provide your own answer first. So again, that pre-planning or pre-writing. And then they were able to use that pre-planning to go and talk to two partners and record the information that their partners said. As I've said throughout this presentation, this research is still ongoing and developing, and I am still responding to the things that I read, modifying things in my classroom, researching more, modifying more in a constant loop. Some areas that I'm still looking at improving and revisiting are really focusing on authenticity, giving students authentic input, not just from me, but also from movies, TV shows, podcasts, news broadcasts, as far as listening goes, and many other authentic resources for reading. I am trying to improve that across the board. But I'm also working on making sure that speaking tasks are both purposeful and useful. So when we're thinking about using language as a communicative tool, I am trying to make sure that the tasks that I'm providing students to practice their language with mimic things that could actually happen in the real world. So you might be asking people about the weather. You might, in small talk, be talking about your weekend or what happened in the past, right? And so those are the two things that I am focusing on the most right now as I am exploring speaking in my own classroom through the context of that double output hypothesis.